Hi everyone, and welcome back. This is the second video lecture that I'm making for research methods, and it's on the assessment of personality. This is not a comprehensive overview of all ways of assessing personality. It's just focused on a few distinctive ways that are kind of representative of some of the breadth of what psychologists do in trying to assess personality. So we can draw a broad distinction between two very different types of personality tests. When I say personality tests, I mean some kind of assessment that you take or that is given to you or conducted that is purported to describe or have some useful power in capturing your personality. So we can distinguish between quantitative tests and qualitative tests. Most of this presentation is going to focus on quantitative tests, so I'll just describe qualitative tests briefly at the beginning. So the first and probably most famous example of a qualitative test of personality are what are called projective tests. So these are not only a distinctive type of test, but they reflect a very distinctive theory of what personality is. So you may be familiar with some of these. One example is shown here, the Rorschach inkblot test. And so you can see this image on the screen here, and you might be wondering, what is that? Well, that's the point of the test. So these tests are used by people whose view of personality derives from the theories of Sigmund Freud. You may have learned about in Psych 101. So Freud believed that we don't have conscious access to much of what is going on in our mind. We don't really know what the underlying issues with ourselves are. And according to Freud, we all have extremely significant, pressing, typically awful, underlying psychological issues that we are not consciously aware of. So the idea of a projective test, like the inkblot test here, is that by presenting someone with an ambiguous image, it's something that does not have a clear meaning, you're putting the person in a situation where they can decide that they have some freedom in deciding what they're going to say they see. The idea is that the decision you make reflects underlying unconscious forces in your personality. In other words, you see what you want to see. So the interpretation of what someone sees, what someone reports seeing in a projective test like this, would be focused on trying to infer what the underlying motivation was for the person to see one thing or another. The idea is that when you have the freedom to say you see one thing or another, or any number of things, that since you have no conscious basis for making this choice, your unconscious desires will be reflected. Not in necessarily an obvious way, but in a way where the analyst analyzing the test would be able to make some use of. So another example of a projective test that's similar is the thematic apperception test. And again, you're presented with an image that, although not totally ambiguous, is still open to interpretation. So in the case of this test, you're asked to tell a story or describe what's going on in the situation shown in the picture. But of course, you could do in any number of ways. So there are other types of I'm calling qualitative tests besides projective tests. Personally, these are actually, I think, the most valuable and useful ways of assessing personality, but they're somewhat straightforward, so we're not going to spend as much time on them. But they include interviews. You can interview a person to try to understand their personality. You could observe them, all sorts of casual, intuitive ways of doing these things that we do with people in everyday life to learn about their personality. Well, I think those are very valuable, and there's a lot of, in terms of techniques to learn in conducting those qualitative personality assessments. We're going to move on to quantitative tests, just because there are some more basic things that I think tend to confuse people with them. And tend to be taken for things that they're not. So we're going to look at two examples of quantitative personality tests that both were developed for different purposes and function in different ways. First is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which you almost always see named as the MMPI. So this is a test developed some decades ago by researchers at the University of Minnesota, I believe. And to understand how the test works, you have to understand what they did to develop it. So the first step was the researchers wrote up a long standardized personality test made up of many individual questions, which in the context of psychological testing, a question is often referred to as a test item. So if a test had 50 questions, we could say it had 50 items on it. So the researchers made up a large number of test questions, or true-false. So an example, I believe, from the test is, nothing in the newspapers interests me except for the comics. So if you were taking the test, you would answer true or false. And so the original test had a huge number of items like this one. So what they then did, after developing the test, they then had a very large number of military personnel take the test, each taking the same test, giving their true-false answers for each question. So they took all of the data collected that way, each person's answers. Now what they did was they followed up and compared the answers that people gave to different items and their mental health history. Specifically, they took some number of mental health diagnoses, like clinical depression, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, and they had records of not everyone is diagnosed with a disorder like this, but of the people who were, they would take, for example, all of the people who had been diagnosed with depression, and they looked at their test answers to find whether there were certain test items or certain patterns in test items across multiple test items where the people who had been diagnosed with depression answered in a consistently different way than people who were not diagnosed with depression. In other words, they tried to find like the sort of typical way that someone with each of the mental disorders would answer the personality test items. So once they did that, then they finally had arrived at what we now know as the MMPI, which is a test where you take the test, you fill out your answers, and then the result is some indication of whether or not your pattern of answers is similar to the pattern of answers that's associated with disorders like depression, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc. So why is this a quantitative personality assessment? It's quantitative in that the development of the test, to develop the test that identifies certain patterns of responses to test items and their relationship with mental health diagnoses. This was done by looking statistically for correlations, for numerical correlations between the likelihood of answering certain questions in certain ways and having received a particular diagnosis. So this is why this would be considered a quantitative test. All right, so moving on to yet another type of test. I want you to imagine you are applying for a job at a Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's or some other very large corporation. The job application process at a lot of these places, which I remember years ago I briefly worked at a Taco Bell KFC combination, and I remember when I was applying being given this very, very long personality test to do as a part of my application. So I would fill in my name and address and telephone number, but then also take this test. I think one function of the test was to just filter out people who were not that interested. So it was a long test. It was very tedious to take. So I took the test, and I imagine many of you have had a similar experience like this with taking these tests. The tests ask you questions about what you're like as a person, what types of things you do. Some examples will be shown, or these are some examples here. The questions or tests would be called test items. Item means question on a test. So typical of the items on a test like this. In the case of a test used for working at a restaurant, there'll also be questions about what you would be like at the restaurant. How likely are you to be late to work? How likely are you to walk off the job with no notice, for example? So when you're filling out these tests, if you've done this, I'm sure you have the same reaction that I did, that basically everyone would have, which is that if they're asking you, are you a nice person? You know what answer they want you to give. It would be a fool to say, no, I'm a very mean person. I'm a very late person. I get into fights with people. Of course you don't want to say that. You know what they're looking for, at least in those terms, as an employee. So when you take these tests and you see questions like, for example, I get stressed out easily. Let's say you're applying to work at the Taco Bell KFC combination. You've been asked, how do you agree or disagree that you get stressed out easily? Now, regardless of what you actually know about yourself, they don't want someone who gets incredibly stressed. So even if you did get incredibly stressed, you might say, oh, well, I want to disagree with that. But maybe not too much. Maybe some level of stress is important for, remaining a diligent, responsible employee. So maybe you'll say neutral, or, sort of between disagree and neutral here. And remember, of course, that has nothing to do with what you actually think of yourself in terms of your tendency to get stressed. So as you're going through and taking a test like this, you might think, oh, what fools. They've made this test. They want to see what type of employee I'll be, but I'm clever enough to lie. Now, this might seem to indicate that the test is not a valid test. Remember concepts we talked about earlier in the semester. In the case of any kind of test or measure, we can speak of their validity and reliability. Is the test reliable? The test valid? These are separate issues. If a test is valid, it means it measures what it's intended to measure. So if you're taking a personality test as part of applying to work at the Taco Bell KFC, then they ask you, how likely are you to be late? And you say, imagine you are actually in reality very likely to be late. You say, I'm very unlikely to be late. I don't think I can recall ever being late. So you might say, agree strongly with I am never late. It's a test item. So it would seem that this is not a valid test, at least for that item. Test is asked whether you're going to be late. You've lied, so the test would seem to be inaccurate and invalid. It could still be a reliable test, that you would reliably give that dishonest answer every time. But it would seem to me that it's not a valid test, right? Well, things are somewhat more complex than this. But there's another issue of validity also. Even beyond lying, assume you don't lie on the test. You try and take it as honestly as you possibly can. Well, take a look at these test items here. What are your honest answers to these questions? I always have trouble deciding. I have so much trouble, I've come to realize that there is no single honest answer. It doesn't even make any sense. Consider, I am always prepared. I can think of times when I've been very prepared, times when I'm consistently prepared. I can also think of times when I have not been prepared. So should I be prepared? Am I neutral here? I'm always prepared. That would seem to say I'm always kind of prepared. But in my experience, I'm often either very prepared or very unprepared, not kind of prepared. The same is true where I don't talk a lot. If I'm trying to answer this, and I think, do I talk a lot or not? Do I disagree or agree? I can think of times when I don't talk a lot at all, but I feel incredibly shy. I can think of times when I talk a lot. Which one should I choose? Oh, neutral? Well, no. Neutral would seem to indicate I kind of talk a lot. I talk a medium amount. But no, my experience is I will be very talkative sometimes, very untalkative other times. That's different than someone who's kind of talkative all the time, right? I'm sure all of you, when you take this test as a part of your personality test reflection paper assignment, you'll feel exactly what I'm describing if you're not familiar with it already. So the point is, even if you're trying to be honest, it's still not clear what the honest answer would be. So it seems like there are two strikes against the validity of this test that we were just looking at. It's easy to lie on the tests. Even if you don't lie, it's not clear what your honest answer would be. So, are these tests not valid? Well, in the case of using a test like this for screening employees, prospective employees, the issue of validity is multifaceted. So it has been clearly found that the types of answers people give on these tests, even in cases where we can have some reason to believe that people are being honest, even then, the answers that a person gives do not really correspond with how they actually behave outside of the test, in a literal sense. But the tests are valid in another way. The reason why McDonald's, Taco Bell, etc., amongst other people, use tests like this, despite the fact that it's so easy to lie on them, despite the fact that it's not clear, even if you're being honest, what your answer could be to any of these test items, these tests are still used because they're valid in a different way. The way that they're valid is, to take the example of the Taco Bell KFC that has every prospective employee, every applicant for an open position, have every prospective employee take this test. So then they take the test results from the employees that they actually ended up hiring. And what they can do, one of the things they can do, and this is similar to what was done with the MMPI test, you can take the test results of employees who you hired, and you can look for correlation between a certain pattern of responses and a certain type of performance or behavior in the job. So let's take the example of maybe Taco Bell KFC keeps a record of every employee who gets into like a violent fight, is violent to other employees on the job. They can look at all of those people, and they also have the personality test that they took. And what they can do is they can look to see if there's a particular pattern of answering of some set of questions that is more likely to occur with people who were violent on the job than with people who weren't. And they found things like this through the analysis of the test results and employee performance data. They found that certain types of employee behavior can be found to correlate with certain patterns of answering on the test. Interestingly, the correlations are not what we could call obvious correlations. It's not like that they're not looking for, oh, did this person say they would be violent in the restaurant? Obviously, no intelligent person is going to say, yes, I tend to get into a lot of fights with coworkers. So Taco Bell KFC is not looking for that. They're looking to find, regardless of what the test item actually says, they're looking to find if there are test items that correlate with those later behaviors. It doesn't matter what the test item means. So, for example, it could be I have a vivid imagination. They could find that statistically, to a statistically significant extent, correlates with violent behavior on the job. So they can find that and they can say, all right, well, we're going to now, going forward, we're going to, when someone takes this test and indicates that they they have a very vivid imagination, so we found that correlates with violent behavior, we're going to be less likely to hire those people. Or we're going to like flag them and not hire them unless we have to. So this is why these tests are used, because they have found through analyzing a very large amount of data that there are correlations between patterns of answers and later behavior outside of the test. So this is a sense in which these personality tests like this can be said to be valid. They're just not valid in an obvious way. Before moving on, though, I want to mention something, though. It's important to recognize that although these tests are used they're useful because they can predict your later behavior, it's important to recognize what this can mean. If you are running McDonald's and you have every employee take this test, you have a massive amount of data, and you can find that certain test answers correspond with later behaviors like stealing from the company. The correlations that are found are never big correlations. They're very, very weak correlations. So it's not like someone answers a particular way and you can say, oh, we know, case closed, they're going to steal from the company. No, not at all. It would be more along the lines of people who answer a question one way have like a 3% greater chance of stealing from the company than the average employee would. At the level of an individual, that is essentially irrelevant. It's essentially irrelevant for understanding an individual person to know that they did something that means statistically that they're 3% more likely to do something. Where it is relevant, though, is on what we could call the aggregate level, the overall level. In the case of McDonald's, if you can reduce violent behavior of employees by 3%, or hire people who are 3% less likely to become violent, over the long run, that would be a really significant advantage. Or it would be worth doing that. If you have hundreds of thousands of employees, that 3% is meaningful. It's not meaningful for understanding an individual person. It tells us essentially nothing about them. It doesn't apply to them even at the individual level, but it applies at the group level with a very large group, a very large pool of employees. So it's important to remember this, that these tests can be useful, but they are typically not useful in telling us what our personality is like. They're useful just in making, predictions that over the long run can yield a slight advantage. So the second quantitative personality test I want to talk about is what's known as the 5-factor test. Sometimes you see the 5-factor theory, or you'll see it sometimes called the Big Five. So what is the 5-factor test? It's, first of all, the most well-known test and theory of personality, the most popular one. And the claim that it makes, the theory behind it, is that personality is made up of different traits, different qualities that are separate from each other. And each person's personality is the result of their having some level of each trait. The 5 traits are shown here: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. So again, the claim here is that each person's personality is the unique result of different levels of each of these traits. So you can have a lot of conscientiousness, very low agreeableness, a medium amount of neuroticism. I'll define these later. the idea is that these traits are separate elements in personality. You have more of one element, less of another element, and that they're separate from one another. So that your level of conscientiousness says nothing about your level of agreeableness or neuroticism. They're like just separate elements. So where did this come from? This theory is unique in that its proponents claim that they didn't just come up with this theory philosophically, they derived it empirically from research. So this is how they did that. The test that we were looking at before is a test of the 5-factor or Big Five theory. If you take this test, the results that it gives you are your scores according to the 5-factor theory. In other words, your level of conscientiousness, your level of agreeableness, your level of neuroticism. So how does it know this? What's going on here? So you go through and you take this test, and I did this just a few minutes ago. You try to honestly answer each of the items on this Likert scale from disagree, neutral to agree. And this is just a subset of the test items. There are, I think, 50 in this overall. And this, by the way, this is the test used for the personality reflection paper. This is the score that I was given when I took the test. You could see I was given this level of extroversion, medium high level, the 67th percentile. Lower emotional stability, so medium high agreeableness, or actually medium high according to this scale, but the score percentile shows that I am my agreeableness is in the 51st percentile, so I'm basically right in the middle of people there. Same with conscientiousness, intellect, imagination higher, extroversion a little bit higher, maybe. Distressingly, emotional stability, very low. So tests like this is an official test that researchers use, but you can take tests like this in a wide variety of contexts. They're not all from the Big Five theory, but the common to all of them is that you answer questions, test items, and then at the end the test tells you, all right, this is what you're like. This is, in the case of the Big Five or the 5-factor theory, this is what your personality is. You have this level of extroversion, this level of emotional stability. There's other tests online that function actually in a somewhat similar way. I think I've seen one that's like, that you take the test and it tells you which dictator you're like, or it tells you which actor you're like. You take the test, it tells you something about your personality that supposedly you didn't know. And I'm certain we have a weird attraction to these tests, as if we're being told something new about ourselves that we didn't know before. And I want to show you how this is actually very misleading. In the case of the Big Five test, as just one example. So I took the test. It gave me these scores for each of the 5 factors. Now, is it possible that I, having taken the test, now looking at this and saying, oh, look, extroversion, I'm a little bit above average here. Oh, I didn't know that. Extroversion is individuals who score high on extroversion are outgoing and social. Individuals who score low tend to be shut-ins. So I've been told by the test that I am in the 67th percentile. So I'm more extroverted than most people. Is this actually telling me something that I didn't know about myself? I mean, I didn't know I was in that percentile. But where is the test? How is the test getting these results? The way that it works is, when the test is developed, the researchers write up a bunch of test questions, have a huge number of people answer them, and then they take all of their results and they perform a statistical analysis, a specific type of statistical analysis called a factor analysis, which means that they look for test items, questions, whose answers, one person to the next, tend to be correlated. So in other words, let's say we have, I like to think of like 1,000 people take a test with, the test has 100 questions or 100 test items on it. So for each answer, they have, for each question, test item, they have the answers for each of the 1,000 people. So what a factor analysis does is to take all of this data and to find what are called factors, which are groups of test items that people tend to answer in a similar way. Not in a like meaningfully similar way, but just in a that their answers tend to correlate. So it's easier to think about it with this diagram here. So this shows 16 items on a test and 2 factors that include subsets of these items. The first factor is made up of question 1, question 6, question 9, question 15. To say that this is a factor means that if we know how someone answers question 1, we can predict how they're going to answer question 6 and question 9 and question 15 at a level that exceeds chance. But that we, from knowing how they answered any of the questions in this factor, this does not allow us to anticipate how they would answer questions that are not in that factor. So if we know how they, let's say, if we know how someone answered questions 1, 6, and 9, if this is in fact a factor, we would have a very good chance of predicting their answer to 15. But not 16, not 14, not 13, not 12. Those are not part of factor 1. So again, to go back to the Big Five test, the way it's developed is you have a large number of people take tests like this. Then you conduct the statistical analysis where you try to identify factors. That's done mathematically. It would be, you would have to spend decades doing it by hand. It would just take an unbelievable amount of time. Once the factor analysis is completed, the statistical analysis program will conclude and then give you a printout, show you, all right, we've identified these factors. The test items break down into these different factors. So you as the researcher then look at those actual test items and you try to determine, all right, what is the factor here? So this is how the Big Five theory was developed. Case of agreeableness. Agreeableness is a factor because a large number of 1,000 people took the 100 item test and they found a factor that included a number of different questions that when the researchers read them, they asked themselves, what is the common factor here in this group of questions that tend to be correlated with one another? And they called it agreeableness. So when I take the Big Five test, when you take the test and it tells you you have some level of extroversion, you have some level of emotional stability, it doesn't really make sense to think of the test results as telling you something new about yourself. All they're doing is just taking your answers to certain questions and reporting back the common qualities of those questions. So showed me I have a medium high level of extroversion. This is not telling me something I didn't know about myself. It's just telling me that I gave medium to high answers on questions whose common element is extroversion. All the test is telling you. And this is why I want to stress that it doesn't make any sense to claim that, well, I thought I was extroverted, but then I took the test and I learned that I was very introverted. The only way that would make sense is if you didn't know what the words extroversion and introversion meant. I have some understanding of how, extroverted I am. Not straight, I think, a straightforward issue for any of us. But it doesn't make sense to let the test tell you how extroverted you are, unless you don't know what the word means. All these results are doing, is feeding back the common element in a factor of questions that you tended to answer in a certain way. So, to wrap this up, we've looked at some different ways of assessing personality. We've looked at 2 quantitative tests, the MMPI and the 5-factor test. We also talked briefly about some qualitative tests, particularly projective tests. 2 very different approaches. The quantitative tests are used widely in a wide variety of contexts, but I think are widely misunderstood. There's this common perception that the test knows much more about you than it does. What I hope you'll take away from especially the coverage of the 5-factor test is that the claims that the test can predict your behavior or that it's gaining insight into you make much more sense at a statistical population level, where they're saying, they can slightly more accurately predict your future behavior in ways that would be useful over the aggregate level with a huge number of employees. That is very different. That does not say anything about, it says essentially nothing about the test's ability to provide insight about the individual person. In my view, 5-factor tests tell us essentially nothing about individuals that we could not. We could learn dramatically more about a person by just having by interviewing them for a couple of minutes. But at the aggregate level, if you have hundreds of thousands of employees, the test results can be a useful data point in trying to save money by, for example, reducing violence at your stores. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will get back to you soon with the next video.